Hello students, I hope you're having a warm and relaxing snow day. We are going to talk about the consolidation of Latin America. Basically what this means is we're going to talk about the period of Latin American independence. We're going to primarily be focusing on the 19th century, although we will be spanning at the end point up until 1920. So, the main thing that, one of the main themes, I guess, that I want you to really take away from this is that Latin America is going to be trying very hard to achieve the types of government seen in Europe and in the United States. However, it's going to meet with significant challenges as Latin American states try to throw off their mother countries and become independent. There's going to be some hurdles that they need to cross that are going to make it far more difficult to establish stable governments and economies. The first of which is the fact that there is very little tradition of a participatory democracy in Latin America. In the United States, for instance, even before we achieved independence from England, the colonies had set up representative governments. There had been voting, there had been jury trials, there had been representation even before we became an independent country. This was not the case in Latin America. So they throw off their mother countries, they throw off their colonial governments, and then they have to really decide, okay, how are we going to run this country? And there's just not a lot of experience there. Wealth and land are unequally distributed. You have a very wealthy Peninsulare and Creole class along with the church, the Catholic Church, which owns a lot of land. And a third problem that we're going to see throughout the period is a dependence on European industry. Latin America will fail to industrialize during this period, and it's going to have some very significant economic consequences. As Latin America moves from colonies to nations, one of the prevailing themes that you're going to see is that the Creoles are the ones to express discontent first. The Creoles generally lead the independence movement. There is discontent among the lower classes, but the Creoles try to avoid getting the support of the lower classes. They don't really want to have Indians, mestizos, and mulattoes involved in these independence movements because they know that if they do, they would have to give them power afterwards, and they don't want to have to do that. And we're going to look at some more specific reasons why in just a second. So, some events that influence independence movements, well, they really start with the American Revolution, followed by the French Revolution in 1789, followed closely by the Haitian Rebellion, led by Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture is kind of like the Latin Americans' George Washington, at least for the slaves and the Haitians. The Haitian Rebellion is famously known as a slave rebellion, a successful slave rebellion. And it really destabilized, as you can imagine, it destabilized the upper classes in Haiti and ran a lot of the landowners out of that country. It does become a symbol for the lower classes, both slaves and free people of color. But for the upper classes, for the Creoles in other parts of Latin America, it's going to become a symbol of something they want to avoid. Other factors that will contribute to independence will be Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal. Basically what this does is it causes a lot of the people living in the Latin American colonies to really question who their legitimate ruler is. When Napoleon invades Spain and Portugal, he sets up his own puppet kings in those countries, and the people of Latin America, particularly the Creoles, really have no sense of loyalty to Napoleon's governments there. So this is definitely going to be a period of intense change as the people of Latin America and the Creoles are starting to see themselves as different and separate from Europe. So first we're going to talk about Mexican independence. Mexican independence starts with Father Miguel de Hidalgo. He leads the independence movement. However, what we're going to see in Mexico is the Creoles will win out. Miguel de Hidalgo rallies the lower classes, but again, the Creoles look to Haiti and they say, we don't want that to happen. We don't want a country where the lower classes are in charge. Hidalgo will be captured and executed. The independence movement will be taken over by Agustin de Iturbide. He is a Creole officer. He will compromise with the insurgents and ultimately will become emperor of an independent Mexico. And Mexico will be briefly established as an empire, ruling everything, basically spanning from what is today Northern California all the way through Central America. After the Central American states like Guatemala, El Salvador split into separate nations, the empire will kind of split up and become a republic after that point. South America will also be leading its own independence movements. This will largely be under Simón Bolívar. Again, he is a Creole. He's going to try to unite the states of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador into Gran Colombia, but he will be largely unsuccessful at these unification efforts, and we'll talk more about that in a second. José de San Martín will lead independence in Argentina and Peru. By 1825, you'll see that all of Spanish South America has gained independence. Brazilian independence will come next. This is generally a more peaceful process, and it really starts with the Napoleonic invasions of Europe and Portugal specifically. When Napoleon invades the Iberian Peninsula and sets up his own puppet governments there, the King of Portugal flees to Rio de Janeiro. And basically, Rio de Janeiro becomes the capital of the Portuguese Empire. King Dom João rules from Rio. More ports are opened up. Learning, technology, culture is brought over. If you remember, we talked about before, when we talked about Brazil, we talked about the fact that all of the Portuguese universities and printing presses were still in Portugal. So any of the Creoles that wanted an education had to go back to Portugal. That's no longer going to be the case. Brazil is really going to develop during this period, but once Napoleon is defeated, Dom João will return to Portugal and put his son, Dom Pedro, as regent. A regent is someone who essentially rules in place of a king. Dom Pedro will rule as regent for a few years, and then he will declare Brazilian independence and become what is known as the constitutional emperor of Brazil. Meaning, he is the emperor, he is an autocrat, but there is a constitution to limit or at least delineate what his powers are and what he's responsible for. Overall, however, little social change takes place as a result of this revolution. The Creoles take control, just like they did in Spanish South America. The mestizo and mulatto classes stay largely intact. Slavery will stay intact, at least for a little while longer as well. So, there are many egalitarian ideals, or ideas about rights and Enlightenment thinking, that form the foundation of independence movements, but when independence is achieved and governments are set up, these ideals do not actually see their way into the new governments. The Creoles will be very reluctant to let the commoners rule. They don't trust them. They don't trust their ability to rule effectively. They don't trust their ability to rule without constant rebellions and anarchy and chaos. So in order to limit the participation of the Creoles, they set up property or literacy restrictions, meaning you can't vote unless you own property in some areas, or you can't vote unless you can prove that you're literate. And that is meant to basically knock out a lot of the poorest and most uneducated people from participating in government. Women also are disenfranchised, meaning women will not be given the rights to vote. There will be a lot of questions about religious toleration and the legitimacy of Catholicism. If we are trying to set up new governments in a post-Enlightenment world, should we still have a state-supported Catholic Church? And we're going to see a lot of people say, yes, we should. Others say, no, we should not. One of the main problems to really confront Latin America will be political fragmentation, meaning they have a very difficult time achieving unity. There are a couple attempts with the Central American Union and Santa Cruz's attempt to unify Peru and Bolivia, but all of those attempts are going to fail. And there are 4 reasons for this. First, geographic distances. It's big. Latin America is very large, and it's very difficult to unify the different regions and climates and lifestyles of this very large region. Internal rivalries, poor transportation, and a lot of political division, as we're going to see in just a moment. The politics is generally going to be put in the hands, as I have said, of the Creoles. Now, one of the sources of power that will become very important in Latin America will be the caudillos. The caudillos are going to be wealthy Creole landowners who will rule the local areas, and they will oftentimes command powerful armies. So caudillos are given charge of small regions to control with their powerful armies. And this really kind of sets up one of the main debates that will characterize many of the countries of South America at this time, and this is the debate between the centralists and the federalists. Now, it will help you to think about these two sides if you think about what you know about China and what you know about India. China, as we talked about in classical civilizations, had a strong central government where the emperor appointed bureaucrats and they were sent out and he remained in close contact, and they had a very detailed list of responsibilities. The central government essentially controlled everything, a lot of minute details throughout China. That is what the centralists in Latin America want, a strong centralized state. The federalists want the opposite. The federalists want local government and regional rulers to have more control, more decision-making ability, more tax ability, more power over commerce or trade. They want all of that to sort of be delegated out to the regional rulers. So these two differing views of power distribution are also going to impact the political ideologies that will grow out of this. At this time and in Latin America, and I'm going to say this very clearly because I don't want you to make the leap to modern day politics. In the 19th century in Latin America, liberals tended to be more federalist and conservatives tended to be more centralist. Again, this applies only to Latin America at this time period. Liberals wanted to see more power in the hands of the people and the local governments. They wanted a secular state, and they wanted individuals to have more control. Conservatives believed in a strong centralized state. They believed essentially that you could not trust people operating as individuals, that corporate groups would provide a more solid structure, and that the best form of that would be a strong central government. So that's generally how people were divided at this time. Political parties will spring up around liberal and conservative ideologies, but once again, most of these political parties are going to be dominated by the elites. The peasants are not really part of the political process. There will be some mobilization of the general population, some very charismatic leaders that will rally the people like Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina and Santa Anna in Mexico. But overall, what you're going to see during this period is that leaders will come and go very quickly. Governments will be plagued by instability. Why don't you see this in America, in the United States? Well, two reasons. First off, Latin American nations really struggled to get over their legacy of colonial independence. The United States had essentially one failed government, and then we had a very successful constitutional government that is still in place today. One of the reasons why our government was able to remain fairly stable was because the United States was able to industrialize very quickly after the Constitution was put in place. The new government set up a lot of things that promoted industrialization and promoted economic diversification. So we were no longer a colonial economy, an economy based solely on agriculture and raw materials. We certainly kept agriculture and raw materials, but we also added factories to that to diversify the economy. Latin America is not able to do this, and we're going to get more into that in the next section. But most Latin American nations will focus on one particular good that they will produce, and that will leave them very vulnerable to world demand. If demand goes down for that good, their economy is going to sink. The other reason, which I mentioned earlier, is something we could call personalism, or just a lack of civic duty. People in Latin America have not grown up with a tradition of voting, of serving in juries, of being an active member of a community like the people in the United States have. And both of those reasons are going to contribute to the instability in the new governments that are set up. I'm going to stop the first section there, and then we will move on to economy next.